When someone once asked Albert Einstein if he believed in God, his answer wasn't what most people were expecting. He didn't mention a figure in the sky, nor did he echo the language of any organized religion. Instead, he said something deeply thoughtful, even poetic. I believe in Spinoza's God, who reveals himself in the orderly harmony of what exists. But who exactly was Baruch Spinoza? What made his way of thinking so bold, so revolutionary, that even centuries later, it would echo in the words of a genius like Einstein? And how did his radical view of God and nature forever change how we approach freedom, happiness, and the pursuit of truth? Let's dive into this extraordinary story, one that starts not with fame or fortune, but with exile, courage, and a mind that dared to question everything. And before we begin, if you enjoy deep, thoughtful content like this, I'd truly appreciate it if you could subscribe and give the video a thumbs up. It really supports the channel and helps more curious minds discover these ideas. To truly understand why Spinoza's philosophy sent shockwaves through the world of ideas, we have to go back to the beginning, his life and the time that shaped his thinking. Baruch Spinoza was born in 1632 in Amsterdam, into a Jewish community that had fled the religious persecution of the Inquisition in Spain and Portugal. These families had risked everything to practice their faith freely, and as a result, the community was deeply protective of its traditions and beliefs. From a young age, Spinoza stood out. He had a sharp, questioning mind and a natural passion for learning. He received a rigorous education in the Hebrew Bible, the Talmud, and traditional Jewish philosophy, and he quickly showed promise as a gifted scholar. But Spinoza's curiosity didn't stop there. He was also drawn to the revolutionary scientific and philosophical ideas sweeping through Europe at the time. Thinkers like René Descartes and Galileo Galilei were changing how people understood the universe, not through religious doctrine, but through observation, logic, and reason. And Spinoza was fascinated. He embraced this new way of thinking, one that encouraged asking hard questions and looking beyond inherited truths. Inevitably, his independent thinking began to clash with the religious authorities around him. In 1656, at just 23 years old, Spinoza was excommunicated from the Amsterdam Jewish congregation. His ideas were considered heretical, dangerous even, although the exact reasons were never officially recorded. Most scholars agree that his controversial beliefs about God, religion, and reality were simply too radical for the time. The excommunication was devastating. Spinoza was cut off not only from his faith community, but also from his family, friends, and cultural identity. Yet strangely, this act of rejection opened the door to something else: true intellectual freedom. No longer bound by religious constraints, Spinoza lived modestly, often making his living by grinding lenses for microscopes and telescopes. But more importantly, he poured his energy into thinking and writing. Though he was not widely known during his lifetime, he became a respected voice among a small but influential circle of thinkers. Admired for his independence and clarity of thought, his personal experience of being cast out for thinking differently helped shape his fierce belief in freedom of thought and tolerance. He had seen with his own eyes how rigid dogma could shut down inquiry, and how dangerous that could be. One of his earliest major works, the Theological Political Treatise, is a bold defense of intellectual liberty. In it, he argued that real understanding, real truth, doesn't come from blindly following doctrine. It comes from rational thinking, open dialogue, and the courage to question. The hardships Spinoza faced, his expulsion, his simple lifestyle, his relentless pursuit of truth, all helped forge his radical vision of reality. A vision that, even today, feels strikingly modern. And at the very center of this vision lies an idea so profound, so different, it still challenges how we think about God. And Spinoza's most radical, and perhaps most misunderstood, idea was this: God and nature are one and the same. Unlike the traditional religious concept of a personal God who exists outside the universe, observing and judging from a distance, Spinoza saw something entirely different. To him, everything is interconnected, woven together as part of a single divine reality. In fact, he summed it up with a phrase that would become central to his entire philosophy: Deus sive natura, God or nature. For Spinoza, those two words were interchangeable. God isn't a separate being watching over us. God is the universe itself, the very substance of reality. Imagine the vastness of the cosmos, the delicate design of a snowflake, the quiet hum of your own heartbeat. All of these, according to Spinoza, are not just created by God, they are God. Everything that exists, from the tiniest grain of dust to the swirling galaxies, is simply a mode or expression of one infinite, self-sustaining substance, God or nature. This worldview is known as pantheism, and during Spinoza's time, it was nothing short of revolutionary. Why? Because it challenged the deeply held belief that God is a personal, emotional deity who rewards the faithful and punishes the wicked. Instead, Spinoza introduced a God without human traits, a divine presence that doesn't will, feel, or judge. This God doesn't intervene in our lives. It operates through the unbreakable, rational laws of nature. In his masterwork Ethics, Spinoza set out to explain all of this, not through emotional appeals or scripture, but through a geometric, logical structure. His goal was clarity, certainty, and proof. In this book, he presents God as the only true substance, from which all things, thoughts, bodies, emotions, identities, naturally flow. Everything, including our sense of self, is just a temporary form within the eternal fabric of God. This was a daring claim, and one that deeply unsettled religious institutions. Because if God is nature, and nature is governed by unchangeable laws, then where is the space for miracles? For divine punishment? For sin? Spinoza stripped away those ideas, replacing them with something more grounded, more holistic. The universe is a single, unified system. In this system, there is no cosmic judge, no supernatural reward or punishment. What we call good and evil are simply human perspectives, not universal truths. To Spinoza, a natural disaster or the fall of an empire is not the act of an angry deity, but the inevitable result of causes and conditions, of nature unfolding exactly as it must. And what about free will? Do we truly make our own choices? Spinoza challenges this too. He argued that just as planets orbit the sun according to the laws of gravity, human thoughts and actions also follow a strict chain of causes. We might feel as though we're free, but our decisions are shaped by factors we often don't fully understand: our upbringing, our environment, our emotions. Yet for Spinoza, this was not a bleak or limiting idea. In fact, it was the path to real freedom. He believed that true freedom comes not from doing whatever we want, but from understanding why we want it. When we learn to see the causes behind our emotions, why we feel angry, jealous, or afraid, we begin to free ourselves from their control. In this sense, knowledge is liberation. And so, in Spinoza's eyes, the more we understand nature's laws and accept our role within this vast, interconnected reality, the freer we become. Freedom is not about resisting the universe, it's about living in harmony with it. This vision of life, calm, rational, and deeply interconnected, offers us a powerful alternative to the chaos of blind passion or rigid dogma. It invites us to see ourselves not as isolated individuals, but as essential parts of a much larger whole. And from that perspective, wisdom and happiness aren't found in chasing desires or clinging to fear. They emerge when we begin to understand the deeper structure of life itself. For Spinoza, philosophy wasn't just a mental exercise, it was a way of life. In Ethics, he lays out a guide, not a list of commandments, but a framework for living with clarity, understanding, and peace. He believed that ethical living doesn't require obedience to rules handed down from above, but rather a commitment to self-awareness and rational insight. Because if we don't understand the forces shaping our lives, how can we ever be truly free? And this brings us to one of the most powerful elements of Spinoza's thought, his theory of emotions, and how they either imprison us. So much of our daily suffering, Spinoza believed, stems from misunderstandings about ourselves, about others, and about the true nature of the world around us. Emotions, in his view, are a natural and inevitable part of being human. They arise from our interactions with the world, our desires, our fears, our memories. But while they are natural, they also have the power to bind us. When we don't understand what's driving our emotions, they can trap us, pulling us in all directions like waves in a stormy sea. How do we escape this inner turbulence? Spinoza offered a bold and hopeful answer, through understanding. Specifically, by grasping the causes of our emotions and recognizing the natural laws that govern them. Just as we study the stars to understand their movements, we must study ourselves with the same curiosity and clarity. Spinoza saw emotions not as random or mysterious, but as predictable responses, events in the body and mind that follow specific patterns. Once we begin to see those patterns clearly, we can respond to our emotions with reason, not reaction. We gain a sense of stability, of inner peace, not by suppressing our feelings, but by seeing them for what they are. As he famously wrote, an emotion, which is a passion, ceases to be a passion as soon as we form a clear and distinct idea of it. In other words, knowledge transforms emotion. Clarity dissolves confusion. Once we understand the root of a feeling, say, anger or jealousy, it no longer dominates us. It becomes something we can work with, rather than be ruled by. For Spinoza, this understanding was not just a personal tool, it was an ethical foundation. He believed that virtue, true moral strength, didn't come from obeying religious commandments or societal norms. Instead, it came from living in harmony with nature, guided by reason. Since everything in the universe is interconnected, virtue means living in alignment with that grand, rational order. Spinoza didn't define virtue as doing good in a vague or sentimental way. Rather, he described it as acting in accordance with reason, making choices that fit with what we know about ourselves and the world. When we act rationally, we're not only doing what is right, we're doing what is best for our own growth and well-being. One of Spinoza's most powerful ethical insights centers around the concept of conatus, a Latin term meaning the inner striving or inherent drive of each being to persist and flourish. According to Spinoza, this drive is at the core of everything that exists, from a tree reaching for sunlight to a human striving for joy. But for humans, this drive is most effective when guided by reason. To live ethically, then, is to pursue our conatus wisely, not by acting selfishly or recklessly, but by seeking what truly nourishes us, while staying attuned to the interconnected web of life around us. This is the kind of ethical living Spinoza advocated, one that supports our personal flourishing and respects the greater harmony of nature. In doing so, we move toward what he called inner freedom, a state where we're no longer tossed around by every passing emotion or external pressure, but guided by a deeper understanding of ourselves and the world. It's a quiet kind of freedom, a freedom that doesn't shout, but steadies. Spinoza's system is not only a guide for personal liberation, it also laid the foundation for the modern world's most powerful ideas. Despite being censored, condemned, and even labeled a dangerous heretic in his lifetime, Spinoza's works eventually found their way into the hands of those who would change history. One of the earliest places we see his influence is in the Enlightenment, a sweeping intellectual movement that prioritized reason, science, and the pursuit of truth. Thinkers like Voltaire, Rousseau, and even Immanuel Kant were deeply influenced by Spinoza's rigorous approach to ethics and his belief in the power of human reason. They drew on his ideas as they built visions of society that favored knowledge, liberty, and individual dignity. His theological political treatise, in particular, was groundbreaking. In it, Spinoza made a bold case for freedom of thought and expression, a dangerous stance at a time when questioning religious authority could mean persecution or exile. But Spinoza believed, passionately, that society could only thrive when its citizens were free to think independently, to explore truth openly, and to live without fear of censorship. These ideas would later become cornerstones of modern democracy and the values of free societies. And yet, Spinoza didn't stop there. His political philosophy didn't just argue for individual rights, it also offered a vision for how governments themselves should function. For Spinoza, a just and enlightened society wasn't built on fear, force, or religious control, it was built on reason. He believed the highest role of government was to enable individuals to live rational and free lives. A state should not dictate beliefs or manipulate citizens through fear of punishment, but instead promote the collective well-being through wise, reasoned leadership. In Spinoza's vision, the best government was one that encouraged knowledge, protected individual freedom, and created the conditions for personal and social flourishing. Leaders, he argued, should guide with understanding, not superstition. Laws should be grounded in the realities of human nature, not in dogmatic decrees. This rational and ethical approach to governance provided one of the earliest intellectual blueprints for secular democracy and constitutional government. His ideas would ripple through history, shaping the thinking of later political philosophers like John Locke and Thomas Jefferson, who carried forward the torch of liberty, rights, and reason. Even today, in the heart of modern political thought, we can still hear echoes of Spinoza's call for freedom, freedom of conscience, freedom of thought, and freedom to live according to one's understanding of nature and truth. But Spinoza's influence doesn't end with politics. In modern philosophy, his ideas continue to ignite debate, especially around complex issues like freedom, identity, and consciousness. His view of emotions as natural reactions, neither divine tests nor irrational evils, aligns with what we now understand in fields like psychology and neuroscience. He saw emotions as signals, as effects of causes that, if understood, could be managed and transformed. Doesn't that resemble the modern pursuit of emotional intelligence? When we examine our emotions, understand their triggers, and align our choices with our deeper nature, we become more whole, more free. Spinoza's insight into the interconnectedness of all things also speaks directly to today's ethical and environmental movements. As the world faces ecological crises and deep social divisions, his philosophy reminds us that we are not separate islands, we are parts of one living, breathing system. Our actions affect others. Our well-being is bound to the health of our planet and our communities. In a world often fractured by ideology, noise, and conflict, Spinoza's message is both timeless and timely. True freedom doesn't come from power or possessions, it comes from understanding. His idea of rational freedom, freedom born not from external permission, but from internal clarity, foreshadowed the ideas of existentialist and humanistic philosophers like Jean-Paul Sartre and Viktor Frankl. Like Spinoza, they believed in personal responsibility, self-determination, and the power of the human mind to rise above circumstance through meaning and reflection. Spinoza's philosophy, then, becomes more than a historical curiosity, it becomes a guide for navigating the modern struggles of fragmentation, anxiety, and isolation. His path is not one of blind optimism, nor one of despair. It is the steady path of understanding, of integrating ourselves with the larger rhythms of nature and reason. He taught that happiness isn't something we chase in the world outside. It is inner harmony, born from knowing ourselves deeply and living in accordance with that understanding. It is found not in controlling life, but in accepting it, wisely, peacefully, and with clear eyes. And in an age overwhelmed by information but hungry for wisdom, Spinoza's voice rings with fresh relevance. He reminds us that critical thinking, intellectual freedom, and the courage to explore ideas openly are essential not just for individuals, but for society as a whole. He believed that a community flourishes when its people are empowered to think, question, and seek truth. That principle remains at the heart of democracy, and at the heart of what it means to live a meaningful, free life. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the life and thought of Baruch Spinoza, a quiet, courageous philosopher whose ideas continue to illuminate the path forward. If you found value in these reflections and want to keep exploring the minds that shaped our world, please subscribe, and stay tuned for more deep dives into the lives and philosophies of history's most fascinating thinkers. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and above all, keep thinking.